Well, good afternoon, everyone. That was just a really cool talk by Malika and colleagues. And now we're going to turn the temperature up just a little bit to chat a bit about drones and wildfire. And my goal for this talk is to give a little bit of a story of how I came to work with drones as one of the many types of remote sensing tools that I look at in my work as an ecosystem scientist. And I'm also interested to, well, we'll see if we have time, actually try to talk about what opportunities drones and wildfire may have, or use of drones for wildfire-related applications to advance hazard mitigation, ecosystem science, adapting our landscapes to live with wildfire, and also public communication and outreach, because so much of dealing with climate change adaptation, which I focus essentially on in my career, involves really working with people in the end. No matter what you study in an ecosystem or what you measure, ultimately, the most important thing is helping people, influencing decision-making, building equity. Oh, one technical glitch. So we'll start with a brief introduction of how drones came into my work. I actually still to this day hesitate to lead with, I work with drones, because often you can get pigeonholed into being, the drone guy, or that's all everybody wants to hear about sometimes once you prompt that. Sometimes working with communities, folks are very hesitant or suspicious of working with drones. How many folks have found they've gotten into sticky situations kind of on a interpersonal level politically working with drones? Yeah, certainly. So it's one tool in the toolbox for me. I hope to spend most of our time addressing drones and wildfire and sort of a dashboard level survey of applications, and I'll get into some of the projects I've been working with pertaining to landscape mapping and wildfire, and then chatting a little bit about the future. So how many of us have felt like this with drones, where sometimes you just, how you learn to stop worrying and love the bomb. Some days it just feels good to get out there and fly. And it's an awesome and fun technology. So it's really nice to be in a place where that's a common thread, bringing folks together. It's very exciting. So my background in a nutshell is as an ecosystem scientist specializing in remote sensing development. How do we measure changes in landscapes, changes in vegetation, changes in surface water, and how do we work across different types of sensor records, be they satellite, manned aircraft, drone, and how do we use different types of remotely sensed data together that say may, for instance, combine multispectral and LiDAR to better measure and monitor things like forest regrowth after agriculture. I did most of my PhD work in Miamba woodlands in Tanzania, looking at forest regrowth. And then about 5 years ago, I started working in California ecosystems, because they are also seasonally dry places that deal a lot with fire and drought. And so across all the systems where I work, be they East African woodlands, California oak woodlands, riparian systems, what motivates me is advancing climate change adaptation, building collaborations. I think there's a really fruitful opportunities, particularly with working with UAV technologies, to build trust and increase transparency, advocate for what use of drones can really do to just show what is in a landscape at really high definition. And sometimes it can cause consternation and conflict. Other times, I found it actually brings people together because, well, there's no disputing just what is on the map when it comes to, say, for example, counting trees. There just are that many in a landscape. And then finally, in my work, I spend a lot of time trying to broaden access to remotely sensed resources, including working with drones. So this is going out with community groups in the US and abroad, and trying to bring this technology to bear to help people get credit for how local know-how, local landscape management is actually accomplishing globally relevant goals. So one example of a type of project that I worked on recently is with a firm called Ecologic, it's a nonprofit based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I did my PhD over on the East Coast. And with drones, we're able to basically just do, pop-up Mavic overflights and some limited mapping to help a community demonstrate that places that they were conserving for primary forest for local cultural reasons, as well as conservation reasons for hunting, as well as just appreciating landscapes. These local communities didn't have a way to interact with the Mexican forestry agency, CONAMP, to actually prove that they were conserving areas. And so we were able to, in a year, help train community forest monitors who were well-versed in doing forest inventories to add use of drones to their workflow. And so by the end of the year, these communities got recognition from the federal government and payments for ecosystem services started for their work. And my current focus is actually finally getting to do some type of structured as opposed to ad hoc community engaged science around wildfire hazard mitigation in Santa Barbara County, because like a lot of places in California, we've got those. We've got wildfire. The program is called the Santa Barbara Regional Wildfire Mitigation Program. You can find it rwmpsantabarbara.org. The overall idea of the program is to try and pursue a multi-sector strategy to basically making the community safer and better able to deal and live with wildfire. And this is complex community dynamics we're dealing with, both sort of wildland urban interfaces, sort of suburbs and exurbs on the borders of forests, but also mountain communities, maybe 50, 100 households that have been there even before the national forests were established. How do you help those folks still be able to live where they are living and adapt to wildfire hazards? So my particular job in this program is I focus on leading landscape adaptations, which is getting beyond just our traditional fuel breaks that you might think of, and also thinking about what types of natural vegetation, ecosystem restoration, where agriculture helps to play a role as a buffer. Basically, irrigated vegetation does great as a place where firefighters can access the backcountry, and it's also resistant to embers and surface fire spread. So it's one place where there's green armor, if you will. And we've recently published a paper on the start of our project first year in Frontiers, and we're pretty excited that we're now working with communities to implement some of these landscape management tools. Drones actually play, I would say, about a 25 to 55% role in the types of remote sensing I bring to bear on this project, because our boundary area is the entire south coast of Santa Barbara. So the boundary area is way too far to cover with drones, and we're not interested in in coverage mapping. What we are interested in is being able to tell stories about key events, key management practices, and be able to complete before and after environmental monitoring to demonstrate to what degree vegetation management around structures or at the wildland urban interface or in rural areas actually is achieving its goals for wildfire hazard metrics, but also minding other ecosystem conservation goals. So drone mapping can advance, I think, a number of things. Landscape characterization for hazard mitigation, infrastructure and built environmental assessments. Are there ways that infrastructure like substations can be strategically protected with trees? There are places where that has happened naturally over time, and we can learn from sort of the natural experiments that have happened. And it's easiest to communicate them if we can document them and share the story, not just by telling someone about it, by showing them with image products. Outreach for community preparedness, ecosystem monitoring post-fire. We'll get to this at the end of the talk. Informing forensic investigation and enforcement, and so many more applications. If there's one thing I want you to remember from this presentation, it's this slide right here. And this, in a nutshell, is, in the 4 or 5 years that I've worked with a wildfire focused on California, this is sort of my roadmap for thinking about different ways and different applications in which drones can plug into wildfire hazard mitigation. So we can think about pre-fire applications, fire applications, and post-fire. and not necessarily all 100% management focused. There's a lot of ecosystems research to be done. And we'll get into an example of what I mean by that when we talk about controlled fire experiments at UC Santa Barbara's Cedric Reserve. So jumping right into an example pre-fire application would be helping mountain communities get a sense of what their vegetation fuel conditions are like when there may have been ad hoc fuel breaks or management happening over 20, 30 years. And well, folks are now getting interested in applying for more grants that CAL FIRE and other agencies are putting out to implement different types of vegetation management. Applications are a lot more competitive if you can show what it is that you want to do where on the landscape. So this particular community, San Marcos Trout Club, is in the Los Padres National Forest in the Santa Ynez Mountains, about 5 or 6 miles north of Santa Barbara town. And there was a major fire in 1990 called the Painted Cave Fire. Is anybody here old enough to remember hearing about that one in the news at all? It's really interesting to not see any hands up because in Santa Barbara, everybody knows about that fire. But here, I think a lot of folks focus more on the Sierras and the pine forests. And it just, wherever you are, whatever region you're in, that's what people focus on. So in 1990, there was a big fire called the Painted Cave Fire that basically turned Trout Club's region, except for the mature oaks surrounding their community, into a moonscape. And as the chaparral has grown back, the community members have implemented mixed fuel break types, but it's been very ad hoc. And so participating in the regional wildfire mitigation program, they're interested in high resolution mapping to prioritize brush clearing and identify where they could try innovative management practices like planned herbivory, prescribed herbivory. I think the city of Oakland, right, is one jurisdiction around here that's really done a lot of that. And so I'd say many parts of Southern California are just catching up. So our objectives is to map fuels treatments using point clouds and orthophotos like we've worked with, or like you guys have all worked with. We want to measure and then group vegetation heights for local fuels type categorizations. And we're particularly concerned about ladder fuels, which are these kind of medium to tall vegetation strata that will transfer a fire moving along the ground, like a grass fire or small shrub fire, up into, say, oak canopies, and then you lose your mature trees. That's the thing you don't want to happen as fire comes through. And eventually, we're hoping to help the community rank fuels treatment priority and suitability for management actions. Lots of logistical considerations. A big shout out to Brandon for granting us permission to do these kinds of flights at all, because this isn't just working in a farm field. This is a mountain community, steep slopes, tall trees, power lines, birds, low-flying aircraft, and winds are all present pretty much all the time here. It took me a number of years to work and practice flying in more controlled environments before sort of taking on all the different risk management. And also, when you're working with a community for the first time, maybe there's some areas that they really want mapped, but if they say, you can't fly over our houses or image any private property, you got to work around those constraints. And so just to be transparent about my mapping methods, because we were all kind of in the weeds with that in DroneCamp, how many of you guys practiced with drone deploy at some point during our, okay, I see some hands up. And how many people were aware of a QGIS tutorial that happened? All right, definitely go check out any supporting materials and curricula that are here for DroneCamp. They're all great and well curated. So I use these tools in real life. I tend to do my flight planning in QGIS because I can bring in other ancillary data sources and get a sense of what the actual scale of relief is that I have to work with for monitoring constraints. I do RTK field georeferencing, and so plotting out sort of where I'm going to go to put out my targets is easy to do that. With places in risk environments, I try not to use the fanciest tools. So I'm using good old trusty Phantom 4 Pro for this type of mission. And basically, it's maybe a little hard to see here on the screen, but respecting private property considerations, we took off from a high point and planned 2 polygons that were just flying over communally managed lands, and then stitching those 2 flights together and processing them together as one project. It ended up being something like on the order of 450, 500 photos, so not huge. And so in this case, we use Pix4D. I work a lot in R and GDAL, PDAL, a lot of open source tools. In this case, I work with R and LiDAR and the LiDAR package to do 3D georeferencing and creating a canopy height model from actually working with the point clouds first, as opposed to the raster images. And then the QGIS tutorial in DroneCamp actually takes you through a way to complete the analysis I'm about to show you for this real project. So if you're interested in an example of how to actually do this workflow yourself, it's all written and documented. Look for that in the DroneCamp website. And I'm happy to hear your comments too about what you thought was clear, not clear, what other types of tutorials you might be interested in. So this is an example of what the stitched together point cloud looks like. And you can see that there are these different fuels treatments where people have done different things when they've gotten the funding over the years to do it. Over here is an area where there was chainsaw and actually someone applied a bunch of herbicide over here. These areas were chainsawed at one point. This was a prescribed burn that just happened that the fire department was granted permission to do on their land. And this line here represents the national forest boundary. And so one point is that just like in this country, as opposed to many others too, including many others, excuse me, often local land management and local monitoring can be so much more powerful and responsive to conditions than a central government top-down authority coming down and saying what to do or running out of funding to do anything at all. Because this is the Los Padres National Forest boundary. And while Los Padres does great work and they've got so much on their plate, they're really understaffed, there's a lot of areas that just have really dense overgrowth chaparral and they're not managed far enough away from communities and sensitive infrastructure. So the analysis products that we get from taking a point cloud, generating a canopy height model, basically by subtracting a digital surface minus the terrain model, we can categorize vegetation by height strata and then quantify the percent cover of vegetation in a height strata in fuels treatments. And so this is a type of analysis that RWBMP is trying to provide and teach and build capacity for doing around Santa Barbara. And so it shows, for example, that, you know, of these fuel treatments, polygons, you know, this East 1 and North number 1 have the highest percent cover ladder fuels. Those might be ones that you might want to target treatment for first. And, you know, again, it puts into very stark contrast the scale between ladder fuels percent cover in the community areas, which kind of range between like anywhere from 0 for recent, you know, prescribed burn to maybe 20s, 30%. And then the Los Padres National Forest is pretty much all ladder fuels. It's 96%. It's just a wall of chaparral. And so after that, Trout Club's actually a really special community, and they've actually helped. They actually have their own drone resources, and so some of their folks are working with me to actually run mapping missions themselves, which I think is really the best end goal. And what they want to do, and you know, since some folks were nodding when we talked about prescribed herbivory, they want to bring in sheeps or goats. I learned something new recently is that if you have a herd of goats and a flock of sheep, you put them together, what is it called? A flurd. So in Santa Barbara, many folks are working with flurds to do prescribed herbivory. So that's so that first example is an example of pre-fire application for drone mapping, and that's helping to address hazard mitigation by working with fuels, identifying places in the local environment to do treatment. Moving right along, fire applications, I think, have some of the most, I'd say, straightforward applicability actually on the research side as opposed to the operations side. In 99.9% of cases, you do not want to be flying your drone any freaking near a wildfire fighting operation because that airspace is precious for manned aircraft, suppression resources to get there and drop water. So you're committing probably one of the 7 most deadly sins of having your drone powers if you even think about being a looky-loo and pop up and try to take photos. Just don't fly around active wildfire incidents like 99% of the time. But instead, you can write research grants and fly over fire in more controlled settings. And so very lucky to have worked with Frank Davis, Matthew Shapiro, and this is a UCANR-led project to look at how fire behavior relates to grass biomass in grazing systems. And the overall idea of the project is to basically get at this third question, which is that in a context where grazing may have sort of an ecosystem service co-benefit of fuels management, what targets should people be thinking about for grazing to actually reduce severe fire behavior? Well, a little bit of background information here is, well, there's been many decades to almost a century of formal research in the U.S., millennia of cultural practices by groups all over the world about how to manage fire. But one threshold that we'll pay attention into in particular is flame length and flame height. At least with flame length as represented by this chart, if a fire were to break out, it's actually a fairly low threshold, not even as tall as you, where the fire becomes too difficult to actually manage on foot. Too much heat, too much unpredictability, and you have to use equipment like dozers or engines. So it can be really advantageous to try and maintain landscapes around wildland urban interface or sensitive infrastructure, such that if a fire does break out, if it can be kept to a minimal level, in a perfect world, it could be that folks on site might eventually develop training to help put fires out. Or if the fire department is called, the fire is mild enough where it can be put out just with a couple local engine crews. Also a lot less costly because it costs a lot of money to fly a helicopter or plane over, drop water. And so in this experiment, which was many tens of people getting together, we took photos of flame height. We did stopwatch trials for rate of spread. We measured temperature with temperature sensitive paint strips that discolor ground temperature reaches a certain threshold. And one variable that I think was the key variable for thinking about how we manage grass biomass was measuring grass biomass. But there's a little bit of a challenge to actually measuring grass biomass where you're going to burn. And that is that if you clip grass plots and measure the biomass, you've just taken away the fuel. So we are looking for a remote way to measure grass biomass such that we could still maintain our contiguous experimentally mowed treatment strips with which to burn and study fire behavior. And so that's where the drones came in. I developed a workflow and basically sort of site-specific calibrations to map grass biomass by calibrating clip plots to multispectral imagery. And because slope is a very important variable affecting fire behavior that differed across all the treatment strips that we burned, after the burn, we flew a Phantom and created DTNs and basically took the drone measurements of slope to work with. And we also did fly during the actual fire. And this was very useful because you can zoom in on the video and actually see the T-posts. And so we could go in and correct and validate field data that people are writing, and also just see how dramatically the fire behavior changes when you zoom in based on variables like fuel continuity or shifts in the wind. So we've actually found this video data just as a resource to be very helpful in our analysis. So really the take-home point is not to dive too deeply into fire science here, although I'm happy to nerd out on that afterwards. The main point I want to raise is, besides just being useful for making maps, drones I found to be a really neat tool to basically be a data resource where from one data set, you can aggregate it at multiple spatial scales and relate it to all different types of observations that you might be taking in your fieldwork. And it's not, and this principle is not necessarily restricted to fire. Whoops. It is in this case. So for example, one way we can analyze our data is look at average fire behavior across these 40-meter long by about 10-meter wide strips and say, well, if you were a grazing operator, if you compare this, if you do an analysis and compare at treatment strip levels, can you identify a point at which a biomass reduction buys you some benefit, and what is that reduction? And so at a treatment strip analysis, we can point out that even a reduction, for example, in our spring burn last year, even a reduction of 500 or so pounds per acre, 550 pounds per acre, was enough to take flame lengths below that 4-foot threshold. So the take-home point is you don't have to graze very hard to have a benefit for wildfire hazards. You can also, so I'm going to call your attention to this figure here. This is an example of a grass biomass map just focused on the treatment strips. And notice how basically we're taking pixel averages of areas outlined by these black boxes. Because we took photos at individual T-posts to look at flame height, we can also run this analysis at a unit scale observation of these T-posts, which we effectively called an area of 2 meters long relative to the strip by 10 meters wide. And you can do logistic regression analyses and come up with kind of a continuous probability field and present your results another way. In this case, if someone was doing risk management, risk analysis, and was asking, well, what grazing threshold might we consider to have a 90% chance of having our flame heights be below 4 feet? Well, there you could run a logistic analysis based on all these different units of analysis and come up with a recommendation of, say, well, go for 2,000 pounds per acre, and so the point is, again, is that these drone maps just enable this multiple spatial scale analysis, and it could be good for fire science. It could be good for looking at invasive species monitoring and mapping. It could even be good for like riparian restoration. Basically, sky's the limit. But just considering that when we fly drones and collect imagery, a wall-to-wall map is not necessarily the only product to be thinking about. And we've actually gone in reverse chronological order in terms of the projects that I've worked with in wildfire myself. This was actually the very first wildfire-related work that I did, was to basically assess flood control infrastructure and contribute to some of the cleanup after the 2017 Thomas Fire and debris flows. Who's heard of that event? Okay, more hands, because it's this century as opposed to the Painted Cave Fire. And this is really where the rubber meets the road for me, as far as collaboration with government agencies and particularly first responders. So I don't have to go into any detail about this tragedy. So you guys are aware of what happened. Santa Barbara County, in the days after the debris flow, needed basically all boots on the ground. 101 was cut off. The trains were cut off. A lot of folks who lived in Ventura had to commute by ferry. The Island Packers ferry that goes out to Channel Islands actually became a ferry service. We still wish that existed, but unfortunately reverted. Anyhow, Santa Barbara County had more than 10 debris basins, which are these they're basically like check dams that catch solid material, tree trunks, anything that could careen down the mountain and basically cause damage to infrastructure below. So there was concern about how they assessed cleanup, how they dealt with keeping track of how many dump truck loads they were paying, all the way to larger questions like watershed preparedness for initial mass wasting events. This rainfall event happened in January, where there's still a pretty good chunk of the rainy season to go, and 2019, 20, last couple of years, the hazards for mass wasting events have gone down significantly with regrowth, but in those first couple of years, they're still there. So we did a small project to do volumetric analyses with structure from motion point clouds and compare what basin volumes after cleanout were relative to dump truck reporting loads. And we also compared it to USGS watershed scale debris flow mapping. Couple things to keep in mind for scale in this analysis is These debris basin sizes vary on orders of magnitude. Design decisions were often based on where there was available land to build them, and not necessarily the size of the catchment or the potential debris flow yield that could happen in a major event. So keep these two numbers in mind. An Olympic swimming pool is about 2,500 cubic meters. A commercial dump truck, all these ones that we love to drive all in around, and we're very thankful for their work, or at least I think we should be, but may not be the friendliest vehicles on the road. 8 cubic meters. Just keep those two numbers in your head, 2,500, 8. For a little bit of calibration validation, we found that comparing the drone estimated debris volumes basically by just drawing a line over the flat surface, like make pretend a debris basin's a bathtub, draw a line over the surface, and that's their capacity. That's not entirely physically accurate because we're dealing with solid material, not liquid, and so things can pile up and the debris basin can still operate effectively. But from these kind of bathtub scale surveys, our measurements in 2018 were within about 15% of county surveyor volumes in 2005. Debris basins may look like this. This is kind of a mid-sized one. And so at 5,800 cubic meters, it's 2.3 Olympic swimming pools, but still 725 commercial dump truck loads to empty that out. And basically, who's done volumetric analyses or pile analyses with drone imagery? That's what we're doing here, using data from the county as surveyor. Actually, the county surveyor went out and did our ground control points for us in this project. This largest debris basin, so you remember how the last one was about 5,800 cubic meters. Santa Monica debris basin is 120,000. That's a huge order of magnitude difference, right? And so this is 48 Olympic swimming pools or 15,000 commercial dump truck loads. They were working on this one for weeks to clean it out. And so this was also an early experiment in developing a workflow that people with multiple drone systems could come in and follow the same procedure and come up with similar and comparable information. So I flew the first map, and then Eric Isaacs, who's part of a very small informal UC drone contingent at UCSB, Eric Isaacs flew the second one. So even though Eric Isaacs is not a geologist or ecosystem scientist, he works in media, he's a photographer. In an emergency, he can still collect valuable data that can be sent to somebody for work. So I think another take-home lesson from the way this project went is as a scientist or whatever your disciplinary field may be, don't turn your nose up at somebody who doesn't have the topical expertise, and separate the topical expertise someone may have from their methods. And of course, we can still talk with folks across common languages in any of these axes, domain expertise, tools, what have you. And so our comparison in this case, sort of the result we had to report was that basically there was a 119,000 cubic meter volume increase that we could measure between February and March 2018 cleanouts. And the contractor reported volume was a bit higher, but not unreasonably higher, because as you break up this material and load it into dump trucks, as the civil engineers say, the material fluffs. Yeah, these boulders and concrete-like material, yeah, it just fluffs up. So the volume that it takes to move it off-site once you mix it up is usually a little higher than the basin volume. But it was a good sort of case study. This is me for scale with one of the bleed towers. So again, like we're talking about these really massive structures here, and they protect us. And so the end result was we got to go present a conference proceeding at GSA on this. And I'll finally end sort of by coming full circle with what I'm doing now. Is across all the projects where I've done remote sensing work using drones in Southern California, the regional wildfire mitigation program is really an opportunity to work hard on the community engagement and involvement, in addition to pushing workflows for, say, machine learning classification of trees or other different types of vegetation that we want to be monitoring. One example where this came in recently was just a couple weeks ago. The report is someone decided to light a couch on fire as part of a TikTok challenge. great idea. This happened. And the situation proved some points. So this point here, the point of ignition for the fire, was way up here. I'm going to click this up, and this is an example of, did you guys do video exports in Pix4D? This is a really cool tool. Basically, it allows you to set things in motion, like the first point cloud. And I think I can stop and start it. And I want to highlight a couple things about this incident and what we can learn for wildfire hazard mitigation from it. Oops. My bad. Technical difficulties. All right, I'm just going to pause it. Now. Oops. Sorry. Thanks for hanging on. Hopefully nobody's getting motion sickness. Go, start. Or maybe I'll just let it play. All right, I'll let it play. This fire burned under 40-mile-an-hour sundowner wind conditions coming from the north off the mountains. And so it ignited and moved pretty quickly down slope. And if this vegetation were an open grass, field, it probably would have gone straight into the community and the electrical substation that you saw first. Because for whatever unplanned reasons, you had oaks here with a relatively trimmed down understory, that vegetation type was enough to mitigate fire behavior in time for suppression resources. The county, it's a Black Hawk helicopter that's modified to drop water, so it's called a Firehawk. The combination of the vegetation type and terrain and having these type of suppression resources basically meant there was no structure loss from this event, and County Fire was really heads up about it. And you can see that the drone imagery and the drone products here, even without any fancy analysis, disseminating that information and using it to tell stories about what did and did not work in an incident is really important for basically generating community buy-in to say, invest in vegetation conservations or not developing properties that are, remaining oaks because they're serving basically a greater societal purpose. So we're coming to a bit of a close. And so again, I just wanted to flash this diagram for you as sort of a dashboard of a way to think about drone applications in wildfire. And you can see it's highly collaborative, interdisciplinary, cross-professional. In the future, and particularly if there are folks who work with drone companies or help write apps, there are so many features that I find could be really useful in my work to build on in the future. For example, and if you know of an app that does this, please let me know. I love practicing these kinds of things. Maybe we could try practicing tomorrow during the session with it. But it's so useful. It would be so useful to be able to in-flight record and send waypoints from your mobile device, basically as a CSV table out to first responders, out to other collaborators, not hidden in the drone memory, but basically just exporting as a live table or being able to, pop it up as a window on DJI or whatever app that is. Because of course we could take photos and download them, right? How come we couldn't do that for waypoints that we might be able to record with the drone? So that's one thing I'd really like to see added. I'd like to see better use of compass orientation, so bearings, either developing ways of recording these with image data or exporting that with waypoints, because if you're flying around and you see something off in the distance that is of concern, like for example, using thermal imagery to identify hotspots after fire, which is one of the few cases where I think drones may have utility sort of in active wildfire events. If a drone's flying and they're not over an area, but they see a hotspot, you want to be able to report, from the drone's position, hotspot at 155 degrees. And sometimes that's a little bit hard to report just within the app. I'm also super interested in corridor mapping and 3D modeling from video data. Often, like in drone deploy corridor mapping right now, you have to go back and forth to get image overlap. But if you could have a camera with a wide enough field of view, might we be able to push the processing such that you could just fly a corridor in one direction, one way, and generate the same types of overlapping imagery by just chopping up the video into itty bitty bits. So I've played around with this on my nights and weekends. But last is, there are so many firms out there that are doing interesting work And these are a couple that I've learned about in the past 6 months or so, doing all kinds of applications and pushing analytics for different aspects of landscape mapping characterization as pertains to wildfire. TreeSwift, which I think started at University of Pennsylvania, doing super cool stuff, flying LiDAR under forest canopies in addition to above. I hope they have lots of insurance in their equipment. I'd love to be there when they watch and fly this, and I'm thankful that it's not my drone being the test one to do that. So props to them. Flight Now is actually a sort of a drone in the box program that actually allows sort of multiple drones to simultaneously connect and operate. So for example, after wildfire, maybe there could be use for sending out a drone swarm to look for hotspots. Maybe in the future, if that was coordinated, that could be something that may have, prevented this New Mexico wildfire incident. So Flight Now is one to watch for advanced drone operations. And then Drone Seed, I don't know who's heard of this one. Yeah, a couple people. This is cool. They got an FAA heavy use authorization to basically fly heavy lift drones and plant trees after wildfires. And so they're doing really cool stuff. I gotta just say, as for a disclaimer, that these are example firms to watch. I'm excited about their work. Their mention does not imply endorsement by the UC system or anyone I work for, but there are so many other firms like this that are really doing cool work. And if you're a student and looking for jobs or employment relating to drone operations, pay attention to some of these small outfits. Even how matter small, whatever your niche might be, there could be a place for you with some of them. I won't belabor this point too much, but I really feel called to build broader access to remote sensing resources such that it's not just, pardon my being really direct here, like white guys in universities and the government using this stuff. And so specific cases would be just like UCANR is right here, university extension programs as key partners to facilitate conversation between industry, public sector, community groups. Doesn't have to stop at our borders in the US. I think the idea of drone libraries with support for training is expensive and hard to get off the ground, but really valuable. And then the idea of service centers that at a public institution, you can pay for them to do some work, offers a revenue stream to basically fund some of these other opportunities. And going forward, some of my own interests, basically, I sound like a all-in-one Captain Planet commercial. Fire, water, forests, and rangelands. These are all topics that my research works on. Remote sensing analytics and education and outreach. So I try to push all these fronts as I can with projects I'm working on. Thanks very much for your time. I'm happy to take questions, and hopefully I didn't go too far over time. Yes, repeating the question was, how do you approach mistrust with doing drone operations on the ground? And my first take is not to lead with drones as a tool. Start with where the community is at that you're working with and the problem in the abstract. What's the information that folks need? And step through ways they've tried to get at the information. It could be forest inventory, it could be water quality, it could be any of these variables. So start with the community and try to understand how they approach the problem and how they've tried to measure in the past. And then I always bring up remote sensing first as something we can do with satellites first. And then drone imagery is usually often one of the last options I choose. And it's still not the most practical tool for a lot of reasons. Like I can work with planet imagery and come up with an ortho photo and kind of a change analysis for somebody from my desk. I don't have to go out and get an ortho photo from a drone unless there's something about getting the information like at that particular time for a particular problem that's useful. Does that? No? Okay. Oh, sorry. The question was, how do you actually approach working with, how do you start the conversation about this? And one is, well, always try to involve more than just one person in the community. Try to talk to groups and committees. And again, ask open-ended questions and wait and listen to hear multiple perspectives coming in. And you may even get a sense of how interested they're working with an outsider who's not part of the community at all to begin with. Never mind, flying an explosive lithium battery around. Question in the back. And what's your name? Lauren. In the open source world, there are a number of packages with Python and R that are available, and there's decent documentation to start practicing with that. The definition of machine learning, I think you would talk to different computer scientists and maybe even come up with slightly different definitions. But keywords to search are things like neural networks, machine learning oriented, object-oriented classification. Basically, you're training software or an algorithm to think and operate within a box, but also to deal with potentially novel use cases that you train it. There are also it's like supervised classification, and I think there's sort of a fuzzy area between when you cross supervised classification to machine learning. But like random forests, for example, which is never really a great algorithm to talk to the public about and say, how did you do your work? I used a random forest. whoever came up with that name wasn't thinking about public perception, but that's an example of an algorithm that's right on the edge between supervised classification, where you can draw polygons and come up with samples of image data, and then feed it to an algorithm that then comes up with ways to classify and identify features. Yes. So I am a beneficiary of many previously worked packages. I don't program machine learning myself, but I use tools that are in Python and R packages for my work. Thanks so much, everybody.